we're starting chapter 3 today. Yeah, how did the time go so fast here? I didn't realize it was moving along at that. Didn't have all kinds of time. All right. Okay. So does anybody remember what we've been speaking of the last few weeks? Yeah, it was the idea of putting man on the pedestal. You know, we talked about how really who deserves to be on the pedestal? It's the Lord. And specific to a church, a body, it's the message. You know, what message are we really focusing on? And I read that quote by Spurgeon about we can't be guilty of preaching Christ too much. So that's the key. And of course, we're in chapter 2. What was chapter 2 of the book about? Division. Right? We said the opposite of division is multiplication or unity. And so that was the whole point, was unity. And so the author does a good job of taking concepts from the first and second chapter of 1 Corinthians and talks about what are ways to unity? What's the recipe for unity? We talked about it displays Christ. You know, it's imitating Christ, really being like Christ. It also exalts Christ, right? And that's what we talked about. Rather than exalting a single person, a man, a preacher, any individual, unity is exalting Christ alone. And when that happens, unity is achieved. And there's humility in terms of, again, imitating who Christ is. And if we think about ourselves or, again, lift up an individual, that leads to division. And last week we talked about wisdom. Again, when we lean towards the world's wisdom, that will give itself over to division. So it's about using godly wisdom. And that oftentimes includes, again, like we talked about, things that aren't impressive in the world's eyes, but in God's eyes alone, that faithfulness. So we're going to move on to chapter 3. But I'll just read the last kind of conclusion to chapter 2 about unity. It's on page 35 towards the bottom. The author says, it's the section marked conclusion. He says, in 1723, a young pastor of a church in Manhattan, Jonathan Edwards, preached a sermon called The Nakedness of Job. He described wealthy Job's sudden losses, which included even the lives of his children, and then he turned to how we ought to respond to such losses in contrast to how the world responds. Perhaps when you read the history of Job, you read it as a strange thing that happened but once in the world. But for the time to come, read it as a thing that happens daily and frequently. For every man at death is as much deprived of all his worldly goods as Job was. The history of Job is only a shadow of death. It is no more than happens to every man in the world. Such is the folly of the world. They pursue violently after the world, slave and tire themselves for a little of it, are exceedingly anxious and careful about it. Their minds are gnawed with care and anxiety. They undergo abundance of difficulties for it. It will often violate their conscience, disobey their God, and go very near hellfire, so near as to scorch them. Come so near to the pit that their feet are every moment ready to slip. When they lose the world, they mourn as if they had met with a loss that is impossible, should be repaired either in this world or next. When they've got a little of the world, they please themselves with the thought of it, as much as if they could never lose it, neither by death or otherwise. Before they were careless and at ease, as if death were not wont to come into their parts of the world. So again, it's a pointing to essentially, again, a lot of division is based on worldliness that creeps into our own lives into the lives of the body, the church. And he talks about this loss that Job suffers and how we should think of that not as just something that one man went through, but that's essentially all of our challenges is to give up the things of the world, to give up the things of the world. And we do that when we come to Christ. We give up all the things that we had previously. We lay them down in the dust for the great treasure that Christ gives us. And like Paul talked about, that's what we have in Christ. We have every spiritual gift we need. And when we realize that, we no longer seek either the things of the world outside the church or within the body as well. That could cause division. So that's just the last closing thought on that. So we'll move on to chapter 3 of the book. And before we go there, I have this screenshot. Does everybody know what this is from? The only person here I'd suspect that knows would be Liam. Liam, what is this?
It's from a game.
Okay, it's from a game. The game is called Among Us. And can you describe the premise or what the game is about or how it's played?
It's about two teams, the crewmates and the imposters. And the crewmates have to try to get tasks done. The imposters, they look like them, they act like them, but they're not on their side. They try to kill them and get them out of the game. But the crewmates have to try to figure out who they are and intimidate them.
Yeah. It's a really interesting game. It's a fun game to watch. There's gamers who will stream this game you can watch. And the funny thing is the interaction that takes place. So there's like 10 people, right? So you're on this little spaceship and you're going about doing these little tasks. Fix these wires over here, go to a different part of the ship and fix something. And there's 10 people doing that, but there's 2 imposters among them. They don't know who they are at the start. And when they're in a room together by themselves, one imposter might kill one of the crewmates. And then after a short time, they convene and talk about it, and they try to figure out who the killer is. So it's almost like Clue, if you remember the board game Clue. Similar to that. And every time you meet, you vote out someone, and that person gets thrown into like this little lava pit. But you don't know if it's the actual imposter or not. You only find out at the end if you've gotten rid of the imposters. So it's this really funny game. The thing that's interesting about it was this is a game that wasn't very popular, and then it blew up all of a sudden. So I wanted to share a little bit about that because it was really interesting. Because it's related to the COVID and the pandemic and all that. As people got stuck at home, a lot more people were on their computers and playing games. And this is a simple game. It's not like a game that younger people only can play. It's like, doesn't require a lot of manual skill and things like that. It's just very simple. It's mostly social skills and trying to figure out things. But I was looking at the numbers, and it's pretty amazing. Guess how much money this game generated in November of last year? Throw out some guesses. $1 million. Okay, $1 million in November of 2020. Who else has a guess? Who said that, by the way? I didn't. Was it you? Okay.
I would go at least 10 times that.
Okay, 10 million. Okay.
At the very least.
Yes, at the very least. Okay. Anything?
Let's go for 1 billion.
1 billion. Okay, that's a big chunk of change there. Any other guesses?
I'll be going higher than that, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, we got $1 million.
Somewhere in here.
I would even doubt 250 million something.
Okay. All right. So in August of last year, it grossed 3.2 million. But then in November, it peaked at $50 million. $50 million. And it was like a $5 game. So it wasn't really expensive. But it was a game that a lot of people got into because it was fun. Like you could play with your family and your friends, and it was social, it was a way to gather together. So, and then they measure games activity by how many people are playing. So in November, that same month, 300 million people had played the game. So that's almost the entire population of the US, right? October of last year, 50 million daily active users. So there was a lot of people. 350 million downloads in November of last year. So a lot of people have played this game, and it had this premise that was really interesting again, where there's a crew and there's these imposters, and you're trying to figure out who are the imposters. What clues did you find out? Because if someone said, well, I went and fixed something, but they figured out, well, I don't think you're fixing that, and then you would put sus on people, this suspect.
Our whole class would join in on one server.
Yeah.
At times, we all play on like 3 times.
Yeah, it's fun. Were you good at being an imposter?
Yeah.
So what made you good at being an imposter? What'd you have to do?
Well, I had to try to act as close to a crewmate as we possibly could.
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, I haven't played in a while, but I think the imposters might have been able to do certain tasks, but you just have to try not to get caught either going into a vent or it's.
Yeah, the imposters could also sneak around. They could take vents from one side of the ship to the other. And the key is that you could really pull off like trying to be a crew member, like a normal person, and act like, okay, I'm just like one of them. I'm just like one of them. So that, of course, leads us to chapter 3 of the book. And what's chapter 3 about? Imposters. Imposters. There is an imposter among us. So this has to do with imposters and false teachers and things of that nature. Now, who is the first false teacher actually mentioned in the Bible? Satan. Yeah. How so? He deceived Eve. Yeah. So that's really the first false teacher, the first imposter in a sense. So the author talks about imposters, and I'll just kind of breeze through the first few pages here. Most of the content is on 39 that we'll focus on, but to start the chapter, he says, were the ministers real or were they fake? It's hard to tell, right? And again, like the imposters in this game, is this someone that's real or are they fake? Or are they imposters? That's what he's asking. It's hard to tell sometimes. They came like the others had come. They looked like the others, maybe a little more impressive or a little more driven. They knew that they had come for a reason. They did not think the way that everybody else did. They knew they would have to speak in such a way as to command respect, even obedience. And that's one of the funny things about this game was the people that are the best imposters are the ones that put sus on other people. They get other people to think, oh, this is the person that's the imposter. They blame someone else. And that person gets thrown in the lava, but they're just taking out more of their competition. Those are the people that are really good. Yeah, they manipulate. But the results of their presence, their words, even their actions would be terrible for them. And again, we go back to the fruit and to what is actually taking place from these false teachers. For a short amount of worldly glory, they and those who followed their words would be repaid by eternal grief. And he mentions how later on the page, he says, we have checks in place to catch them now. There's things the Bible has given us to show us how to identify false teachers and false teaching. Moving on to the next page, on page 38. He says, the problem was that people were being fooled, misled, and deceived. Fewer people were prospering, but the gospel was being obscured from view, silenced by a seemingly effective substitute message. So again, we see what's being put on that pedestal isn't the gospel. It's something else, right? And that's one of the misleading things that always takes place. The true congregation was facing, in a word, imposters. And of course, we're talking about the Corinthian church, right? But this is true, as we'll see today, of every church mentioned in the Bible had some interaction with false teaching. Now, what's the solution? The solution Paul puts forward in his first letter to the Corinthians, complete with a promise of visit to come. Now we turn to examine that in the 4th chapter. So This is chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians. Let's turn there real quick. I'm just going to start by reading the first 2 verses of chapter 4 of 1 Corinthians. Paul says, "Let a man regard us in this manner, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. In this case, moreover, it is required of students that one be found trustworthy." And really, we could end the whole discussion about imposters and false teaching with these 2 verses. Stewards and servants. And of course, how has God related stewardship in the Bible? What parable have we read before in the gospel that talks about stewardship? Does anybody remember? Okay, does anybody remember the parable of the talents? Okay, what was the parable of the talents?
That's when one was given 1 talent,
Yeah,
one was given 3 talents, another was given 5 talents. The one with 5 talents invested the 5 talents.
yeah,
And came up with 10, and he was given much more to take care of.
yep,
The one with 3 was similar to that one, but the one that only had 1 talent, he hid it in the ground.
yep,
And his master was displeased with him because he said, "You knew that I'm not the kind of person that's going to sit on my laurels and be happy with 1 talent. I would have worked to make 2.
yeah.
That's what I expected.
Yeah, and so what's the expectation then when something is given to someone as a steward?
You're to take care of it and to try to improve on it.
Yeah, it was profit was the idea. So whatever we're given by the Lord, he expects us to use and return with a profit. And of course, one of the greatest gifts we have is being stewards of the gospel. He gives us the revelation of Jesus Christ and the mystery of the gospel that is revealed to us. And so Paul talks about that. He says, "Let a man regard us in this manner, servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God." So think about that. We've all who have come to know the real living God through Jesus Christ, through his death and resurrection, have become stewards of the mysteries of God. These are mysteries that were revealed through Jesus Christ, prophesied for thousands of years beforehand. Nobody could really figure it out because who would have guessed that he would have come as a servant and willingly let himself be sacrificed, crucified, but then 3 days later, boom, pops out of the tomb and rises again, bodily, physically resurrected, appeared to his disciples for a time, and then ascended to heaven. And then that we could know that same resurrection by putting faith in Christ and have that same promise of being able to know that we have that promise to us because our sins have been forgiven because he paid that penalty on the cross. That's the steward. That's the idea of being a steward of the mystery of God, that we have that information. The Lord has given that to us. And so that's what Paul's talking about. He says, "Let a man regard us in this manner, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God." So it's a steward and a servant. Those things go hand in hand. Like we talked about. Is that me? Or is that, okay, that's you. I just want to make sure I'm muted. That's, again, easy way to avoid division is by making sure someone is a servant and a steward. A servant doesn't seek to put themselves above others, but they're humble. They exalt Christ above themselves. And that's their message, Christ. It's not themselves. And their key motivation is profit for the kingdom, not profit for themselves. It's not to become rich. It's not to be on the best sellers list. It's not to get the most views on YouTube, not to get the most attention on social media, right? It's to put the emphasis on the cross and get the most profit for the message. And the message is the mystery of the gospel, making that known and making it profitable for those that hear that message. So that was Paul's focus. That was his emphasis. And that's what the author talks about on page 38. He says a cross-centered message, right? It's about the cross. And he quotes Paul from a little bit later on. Let's see, I don't know what verse. It's verses 2 through 5. Let me see which one it is. I think it's verse 4 he talks about here. It's a slightly different version. He says, I care very little if I am judged by you or by any human court. Indeed, I do not even judge myself, right? And so I think it's verse 3. My NASB version says, but to me it's a very small thing that I may be examined by you or by any human court. In fact, I do not even examine myself. And he goes on to say, for I'm conscious of nothing against myself, yet I am not by this acquitted, but the one who examines me is the Lord. So Paul, again, wasn't consumed by what others thought of him. His main focus was, am I being responsible with what God has entrusted me? And the Lord had entrusted him with the gospel, the mystery of the gospel, to make known and profitable among the Gentiles. So what I want to look at a little bit is a few ideas in the New Testament related to how prevalent the imposters are. How many imposters are there throughout the New Testament? How many times did imposters make it into the churches, and how did they do so? So any ideas in terms of how imposters get into the church?
They act as if they're not imposters. They act like the sheep.
Yeah, right. They try to blend in. It's an idea of blending in and being like one of the crew, right? Just one of the crew. But then eventually, what gets revealed is that they're not. So we're just going to take a real quick look. I don't want you guys to turn to all these verses because there's going to be a lot that I read, but I just want to get a sense of how prevalent false teaching and imposters are throughout the New Testament. So I'm going to read through a number of these verses. In Matthew, Jesus speaks of it saying, beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Again, it's this idea of blending in. And then also in Matthew, and false teaching, again, doesn't always take on one form, but he talks about the false teachers really in terms of the Pharisees. He says, Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples saying, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Again, kind of exalting themselves. Therefore, all that they tell you, do and observe, do not do according to their deeds. For they say things and do not do them. And again, someone who is a good minister imitates Christ and practices what they preach, right? They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. But they do all their deeds to be noticed by men, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. So again, they like attention. They seek after attention, right? And then the phylacteries were these like wooden boxes they kept on their forehead of all the verses they had memorized. So it was a way for them to kind of brag about how much knowledge they had. They loved the place of honor, at banquets and the chief seats in the synagogues, and respectful greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by men. But do not be called rabbi or teacher, for one is your teacher, meaning the Lord, and you are all brothers. So again, there's this idea of the only one that goes on the pedestal is the Lord, And then we have this even playing field below. Do not call anyone your father, for one is your Father, he was in heaven. And he goes on to warn the Pharisees, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people. For you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. So it's dangerous. Like, false teaching is dangerous because it keeps people from understanding the truth. And again, it's from within the church itself, right? It's on the ship, as it were, like this within the body where this teaching takes place. And he goes on to say, woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold in the temple is obligated. Woe to you, blind men. Which is more important, the gold of the temple that sanctified, or the temple that sanctified the gold? So he goes on to warn about the false teachers there as well. And I'll move on. In Acts chapter 20, Paul is speaking. He says, I know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among you, from among your own selves, men will rise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. Right? Just like the game Among Us, right? It's the same thing. He says, I know after my departure, savage wolves will come in. And again, they're not wolves in their appearance and the way they act outwardly, but on the inside, this is their true nature. From among your own selves, men will arise, right, from within, speaking perverse things. And again, the idea of perversity or perverseness is this twisting around of things, a twisting of words. And again, we see that because Satan, being the ultimate false teacher, works that out through false teaching. That it's a message that can be similar to the Bible, taking words from the Bible, but yet twisting it in such a way that in the end, the focus isn't on Christ. And that's what's so deceptive. And that's what we have to guard so closely about. Now, how does false teaching enter into our lives and into the church? What are some ways that can happen?
When we're not like in the word and being actively growing in our faith.
Okay, so one way is when we personally are not growing in our knowledge of the Bible itself, right? If we're not actively in the Word and familiar with it, that's one thing I think that can make us vulnerable to false teaching. But what are the ways that false teaching gets into our minds?
Maybe when we're seeking a shortcut.
Okay, and how would that take place?
Well, like you think you can buy your way to where you want to go.
Okay. Yeah.
If you're doing good works because you expect a reward for the works, it's not exactly doing good works. I mean, if you're looking for a pat on the back,
Mm-hmm.
you pretty much get that from them. You already got your reward.
Yeah. The idea of sort of false notion of doctrine for us and a false gospel would be us seeking after God's affection by doing good things, right? We know that God is pleased, but we have his affection through Christ. So that is the one way that we're pleasing to God, through Christ and through Christ alone. We do good things and it's pleasing to God, it's glorifying to God, but that doesn't add to his affection for us in any way. So what I'm looking for more specifically is, again, how does false teaching get to us? What are the modes? What are the methods that a false teaching, false doctrine can get to us?
Whatever you watch or hear, listen to,
What?
music,
Music, TV, and what were you saying?
movies, let the things of the world. Yeah.
Okay.
Tell us what it's okay to do this or so going along with the worldly things.
Yeah. Now you mentioned music. Now, what kind of music?
Even Christian music.
Yeah.
We listen to sometimes it's just not accurate.
Yep. So we have to be discerning what we listen to in terms of the music because everything influences us.
Yeah, the tune is great.
Yeah. Yeah, before you know it, you could be singing around along to something that isn't true. And what else? You said television? Like, how could television lead us astray?
Well, I mean, I'll be honest, like, there's this program that I've been listening to or watching and thinking, and I'm thinking to myself, and I'm asking God, like, is this, and you guys talked about this yesterday, like, just be aware of what you're watching. If it's not giving accurate doctrine, then, and I'm not even sure about that. I'm just being, I think the Lord is kind of putting in my head, like,
I think what Darrell
be
was saying,
aware.
we had a videotape that we were watching, and it had like 12 little short stories.
Yeah.
And one of them was Cain and Abel. And it was Cain and Abel, and it was when Cain offered his sacrifice to the Lord, and when Abel offered his sacrifice to the Lord. Well, they were saying, well, we don't know why God was displeased with Cain. We know why.
Yeah, he
was
says
displeased.
what? Yeah.
Okay, but it was more of like a child for kids thing.
Yeah.
But you can see where kids could be, and that's what Darla was saying right there. Like, it sounded like it was Bible stories.
Yeah.
I mean, something you'd say, wow, I'll let my kids listen to this.
Yeah.
What do they learn?
Yeah. Yeah, because when we talk about television, we talk about movie, and I'm sorry, you had a point to your
Yeah, I was, just to give you an example, I was watching Noah's Ark, and I thought it was biblical. And I watched 10 minutes of it, and it threw me off.
Yeah.
I said, "Ow." No, they weren't even, it was not even the same thing in that. But it's easy, you're easily drawn,
Yeah.
thinking where you're gonna learn something, and it's biblical, and it's not, and even preachers.
Yeah.
Different preachers, like I love to listen to Charles Stanley. I even go to Billy Graham
Mhm.
because we know that it's the truth.
Yeah.
But there is false,
Yeah.
And you can tell they're just there for the money or,
Yeah.
and it's like,
Very dynamic.
yeah. So you have to be really.
Yeah, you have to be
careful who you
discerning.
listen to,
Yeah, because when we talk about movies or television or music, like it'd be easy to say, oh yeah, like all these worldly things are seeking to lead us astray, and they are. But again, we really have to be careful of are things that are disguised in the wrappings of the church. Something that's quote unquote Christian. That's the most dangerous thing. Because devotionals.
Yeah, too.
Yeah.
Devotionals are the in thing today. I do my devotions. We get hooked on sugar and emotion, and we don't even notice the false doctrine
Mhm.
that comes in with it.
Yep. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just saying it's true. It is,
Mm-hmm.
what he's saying.
Yeah, like so there's a lot of different ways because in the time of the New Testament and a lot of the epistles, there's a lot of ways that these things infiltrated the church. Not as many, I think, methods maybe as now that we have, because there was literally teachers walking in and becoming part of the fellowship and then talking to someone on the side and saying, he's right about this, but have you ever thought about this, that, and this that isn't true? That's happened. I know that's happened here in the last few years in our church. It might have been someone that came in and was part of the congregation for a while, but then would have side conversations. So you always have to be aware of that. Also in Paul's time, there were people who were imitating him, writing letters saying they were Paul, sending them to churches. I think it was Thessalonians, right? So the Thessalonians received a letter, and it was telling them, like, hey, the rapture already happened. The Lord already came back. You missed it. And they were like, wow, that doesn't sound right. You have something to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was going to say that even the pastor of a church or a Sunday school teacher like you.
Yep.
We cannot depend on you or a pastor. We have to read it in the Word ourselves.
Yeah. And that's why, if anybody's familiar with Dick Goopel, one of the first
Yes.
preachers in the valley here. Well, not one of the first, but one of the most recent significant ones. He had something he always said that I love: "Don't believe a word I say." And that goes for me. It goes for anybody who speaks, gets up and speaks or teaches or anything like that. Look for yourself. Examine it for yourself, because I'm, you guys know me. I'm not a Bible. I didn't go to Bible school or anything like that. I study, I prepare, things like that. But yeah, you always have to examine everything for yourself. We should never take anything at face value just because of someone's position. So it's definitely true. But again, in Paul's time, there are people that crept into the fellowship. There are people that could write a letter. But in our time, there's a few more other types of media that can get to us that bring false notions. And it can be just misleading enough where it goes astray. And again, it's through music. It could be, quote unquote, again, Christian music, Christian devotionals, Christian books.
Even something how it's presented.
Yep.
I mean, we were talking about this too yesterday. We watch, Christian movies, and Jesus was a man just like us.
Mm-hmm.
But boy, when he's in every movie, he's the biggest wimp that they ever had. So gentle and so. He was gentle, but
yeah,
he was like us. I mean, I'm trying to say it. They just make him out to be a wimp.
Yeah.
And I'm like, he wasn't.
Yeah.
He came here when he preached, he must have preached with conviction.
Right.
That people listened to him. If he talked like really soft.
Well, yeah, there's this idea that Jesus was like this hippie, right?
Exactly.
And that's what I grew up knowing Jesus as, a guy with long hair that was real kind and gentle. And he was gentle, but he also overturned some tables at the in the temple. And things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, we always have to be really discerning when we see those things. And there's a lot of like tendrils of this false teaching that can get to us. And it affects us in ways we don't always understand. Before we know it, we've been tricked by these imposters. And the other thing is just video in general. There's videos on YouTube, and then of course any video can get linked anywhere.
Yeah.
Facebook and whatever, Instagram, Twitter, all these things that are possible out there, TikTok, whatever social media you're on, but anybody can post a video. And the problem with that is that we don't we can examine a preacher, a pastor, a teacher, someone in the fellowship based on the fruit of their lives. Are they imitators of Christ? And the biggest problem is if you watch a video of someone who lives in another part of the world, how can you examine the fruit of their lives? How can you really know? And that's the thing to take into consideration, is there's no way to tell what fruit they have. And of course, there's definitely things of value. People that we know, like Billy Graham, okay, we have a pretty good understanding of what his life was like and the fruit of his life. But with anybody who has a video, like I said, anybody can post a video. We don't know what the fruit is. And then also examine what is being exalted. Is Christ being exalted, or is there something else? Especially in our times, I've noticed for the last few years, fear is a factor. Fear is being sold. Paul wasn't concerned about fear. Again, he was concerned about exalting Christ and about leaving the world behind. And so much of our messages right now that I've seen are about this fear of what's happening, what's really happening, things like that. That shouldn't be our focus. Our focus needs to be Christ, and that's it. So again, we have to be discerning with anything that comes in, anything that comes into our lives that could be possible false teaching. So again, there's this idea of a savage wolf, right? Of someone that is among us. So I'm going to read a few more references in the New Testament. We're almost out of time already. I started late. I guess I'll finish up with this. I had so many Old Testament things to read. And then on top of that, my little app isn't working. Let's see. Give it a second to catch up. But I'll read from the book for a little bit here, and we might just finish up with that. So on page 39, the second paragraph down, the second full paragraph, he says, what is the one thing such a steward is called to do above all else? A steward must be faithful. It's required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. Of course, Paul's statement was an implicit condemnation of any unfaithful teacher among them. According to 1 Peter 4:10, all Christians are stewards, but ministers especially must be trustworthy. So again, there is more scrutiny for people who are in positions of being a teacher or a pastor. Every believer is a steward. Every believer is called to be accountable for what they are telling others, sharing with others, how they're using what God has entrusted them with. It says, we teachers of God's word will be held to stricter judgment, as referenced in James. Ministers are like bankers, entrusted with a great deposit. We ministers of the word must be faithful in our work because of the great value of what has been committed to us. We're not concerned to be original, but rather reliable. That's a beautiful statement because so many people want something different, new, novel. Jesus, he's great, but isn't it kind of boring? Don't you want something a little bit more exciting, something more fulfilling? Well, that's the trouble that we can get into. The real truth is there's nothing more dynamic, exciting, joyful than knowing Christ. The problem that people run into is they don't want to give up of themselves or things of the world to get there. That's what you need. And that's the truth. And that's what people don't want to hear. Put aside the things of the world. Put aside yourself, the love that you have for yourself, the desire you have to fulfill all of your wants rather than all your needs. Our really only desire and need is joy in our lives. And that's Christ is the only one that can really fulfill that. A false teacher will somehow wrap Christ up in things of the world and say, in order for you to find joy, Jesus will give you these things, the house and the car and the family and everything else. So it's deceptive, right? So again, we're not concerned with being original, but reliable. And there's only one foundation, which is Christ, which Paul talks about in Corinthians as well. That's the only foundation. So make sure that whatever is entering into your life in the form of teaching, Christ is the foundation there. There's nothing else. It's not an experience. It's not a feeling by itself. It's not something novel or new. It's Christ. Christ is the only foundation there. And it says we recount the gospel of Christ crucified and today obviously resurrected as well. No one, not the Corinthians or believers today or ministers, even Paul himself, has the authority to change the message. The message always remains the same, always remains the same. And someone's response to that doesn't determine whether or not it should change. If people stop coming to church, they stop coming to Bible study, if they stop responding, stop giving money, the message stays the same. We don't change it for anything. It's always to remain the same. All right, well, I think we're at time. It's only a minute over, I think, on my clock's fast, so I think we're okay. So, all right, go ahead, Dan, if you could finish in prayer for us.
Oh, Father, thank you. Thank you so much for reminding us of all of this on Resurrection Sunday. And each Lord's Day, Sunday is a resurrection day, Lord, because that's why we come together. He is risen. He is risen indeed. We rejoice in that. Oh, Father, thank you. Thank you for speaking into our hearts. We just pray that we would glorify you as we continue to worship and praise you in your holy name. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Is it okay if I use the photocopy for